Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the second lecture video for this week. So in this week, I'm going to be looking at the Tulathimutte story, The Feminist, and just to give some kind of justification for what I'm about to do, I've noticed in the past couple of weeks that, and partly my fault, that we've been kind of engaging in the practice of criticizing the men depicted in these stories, and rightfully so. And the story that we have next, The Feminist, has another man that is very easy to criticize. He's basically a horrible person, especially by what he does by the end of the story, which is a little bit up for interpretation, but does kind of seem to be kind of an act of violence. Or kind of incel terrorism that the Canadian government is now put on the watch list. The incel kind of ideology as a terrorist ideology. So that's where the story seems to end, and this person is certainly clearly flawed. But in this video, I'm just going to be doing a sympathetic reading of this story. So trying to read the story as sympathetically as possible, try to get something out of it that isn't just criticizing this person, which I'm completely open to disagreement if any of you disagree with this practice. It's kind of just an experiment for me, so I'm just going to get into it. Okay, so here I have a beautiful picture of Benedict Cumberbatch wearing a shirt that was popular, probably still is popular. This is what a feminist looks like. And yeah, I'm not critiquing Benedict Cumberbatch, obviously, but there is a certain kind of presentation of feminism that can be at odds with how a person behaves, which is definitely what this story gets into. Okay, so I just wanted to start with this tweet. I find it humorous that the author of the story had to add this kind of comment to his story when he originally posted it on his Twitter. So the comment was that, to be clear in advance, feminism is good, this character is not good. So that was just basically to make clear that this story isn't a critique of feminism, even though maybe that's going on. And also, this story isn't kind of a justification for where this character ends up by the end of the story, which is how some people might read it. Basically, Tony Tulathimutte was guarding against the story being misread. And yeah, it's interesting whether an author really needs to say this. I'm curious what you guys think, whether this statement, this defense of the story is necessary. There was a lot of online reaction to the story. It was reacted to in the incel forum on Reddit, or the incel exit forum on Reddit, where there was a long discussion of the story. And it did seem to be, I just read the thread a little bit, it did seem to be having a positive effect there, so that people, mostly frustrated men who were subscribing to the incel ideology, did read the story and see themselves a little bit, and see themselves in a way that could lead to change, so that they didn't end up where the character in this story ends up by the end of it. Yeah. Okay, so as part of my sympathetic reading, I am gonna, and this is kind of not totally, not totally, I don't know what the right word is, but not totally honest, but I'm just kind of gonna talk about similarities between the feminist character and the woman. It's kind of interesting that neither of these characters, the woman character, sorry, from Mary South's short story, You'll Never Be Forgotten, it's kind of interesting why none of these characters in either of the stories are named. And there's no names for any of the characters. And why that is, I think, is another kind of interesting question. Looking at both these works, I would kind of just fall back on my kind of archetype argument that I made for Cat Person, that the reason why these characters aren't given names is because they are kind of archetypes, meaning they aren't so much real people. they are kind of just more representative of large groups of people. So women as a whole, or male feminists as a whole. Okay, but yeah, some similarities between these two characters. So, like I'm saying, this is not totally honest work, but they both kind of at least give people the impression that they've suffered some kind of trauma. And obviously, those levels of trauma are very different. But so here's the representation of trauma from Mary South's story. Sometimes, after too many hours in front of her screaming panel, the woman will start to float above her own body, as those who have had near-death experiences or been the victims of a crime, rape, for example, claim to have done, aware that it will end, but forced to wait until that end. So this story presents a traumatic encounter that I don't really need to elaborate on how it's traumatic. The traumatic encounter represented by the feminist is quite different. There isn't really even kind of language that, I don't know, that we can use to kind of describe what happens to this character, the feminist, as trauma. He seems to think he's been traumatized by society, but what exactly that trauma is, he never gives a kind of clear impression of what that is. Although maybe some of you saw that in the story and can enlighten me. But this is how he kind of presents it at one point, when he's having the argument with another nameless character in the story, his QPOC friend, queer person of color friend. Vitrified with outrage, he replies to his friend that they were minimizing his problems just because rejection wasn't on some official registry of politicized traumas. So his trauma is basically rejection, which I don't know if that's a trauma, but I'm open to what you guys think. Both these characters are lonely. Loneliness is obviously a theme very kind of represented in Mary South's story. So the protagonist, the woman, has no real connection to any of her coworkers. She goes home alone to an empty house where the family that is living there is gone. She's just completely alone there. She's being harassed by the neighborhood boys. She tries to connect with her ex or the rapist girlfriend, and there's complete failure to connect. She doesn't really connect with anyone. She doesn't even really connect with the Mountain View mountain lion. So she's a very lonely character in that story, and loneliness comes up as a theme again in the app that the rapist's girlfriend designs, which she writes, this app is the only app on the market intended purely to solve the problem of loneliness, and which is a problem that a lot of kind of social media apps try to solve. And then there's a very kind of strong image of loneliness as well in The Feminist. He goes home alone, weary and dark-minded, to face the sight of his empty bed, which is even emptier after he gets in it, lying awake with pangs of loneliness that feel like getting stabbed through a very soft pillow. Another kind of similarity between these two characters or these two stories is that when they're engaging this kind of like digital communication, whether by text or by emails or whatever, on like dating apps, there's a point in both stories where they don't get the response that they want from the other gender, basically. And in the Mary South story, she writes, what she gets is nothing. The rapist ghosts. Her need for a reply, if only a nasty one, becomes more urgent and not less. So this is after the woman has kind of presented to the rapist her story of being raped, and she doesn't receive a response. And then similarly, but again, different scale of what's the violence being enacted upon these people, I think. In The Feminist, this is after he suffers the trauma of rejection, and he writes these long emails trying to figure out why this woman rejected him, which he says is something that happened 4 or 5 times in college. So he writes, or the story goes, considering his tremendous effort to be vulnerable, it seems unfair when a day passes with no reply. So again, there's this kind of disconnect, And yeah, the reasons for that disconnect, I think, are different, but it is a little bit interesting that these kind of technologies of communication, they can leave people at this kind of very empty point when they don't get a reply to their messages. Okay, so continuing the sympathetic reading of this story, particularly to the character, I think there's like an actual kind of good, not good, but like a useful perhaps critique of the couple form going on in the story. So just getting some quotes from those stories. And as he's aged, has his intimacy with his female friends deepened? Did these friends, who always maintain that romantic love is overrated, provide an alternative to monogamous romance? No. They've all found partners and moved on to mature, cohabit, fuck, get married, spawn. So the way that he presents these thoughts are kind of vulgar and overly just like nasty. But I mean, well, I'll get into the kind of the critique of the couple form. But I mean, he's kind of I think articulating something that does affect people that are alone in contemporary society. That the only form of getting the need for kind of recognition, for love, for touch, is the couple form. And there's been critiques of the couple form from all kinds of people, not just the feminists, but from queer people, from trans people, from fat people, anyone who's critiquing just kind of the heterosexual couple form for the people that it kind of tends to leave out and who kind of suffer at its margins. So here's another quote from the story. Now it is masked with couples and their he's talking about this kind of hip taco joint. Now it is masked with couples and their offspring colonizing yet another space, basking in the triumphalism of love, instead of confronting the real ugliness of their prejudice and superiority, and yes, the privilege that they profit from. So, I mean, there is a kind of privilege to being in a couple, obviously, from financial to living in the same space with another. There's living in the same space with another person. To just kind of simple stuff like posting on Instagram. Like couple photos get more likes than any kind of other photo usually. So we live in a society that kind of really is attached to the couple form, and the couple form does leave people out, including the feminist. And his suffering for being left out is real, I think, even though the way that he articulates that suffering is horrible. So I'm just moving on to a kind of more substantial critique of the couple form, and this is from Hannah Black, who's a visual artist and cultural commentator. And I'm just going to be drawing these quotes from a text that she wrote called The Loves of Others, and that's in the New Inquiry. I'm just going to read these quotes out. So the couple is the most reductive, exclusionary, and precarious imaginable method of meeting the probably universal need to feel close to and recognized by others. Nevertheless, the couple dominates the imaginary realm of love, so much so that people who are not in couples are described negatively in relation to it, single, divorced, etc. The hope or mirage of kindness among strangers, of love among friends, is at war with the intensive familiarity of romantic love. You don't have to be a couple to participate in the couple form. You can watch movies about couples, you can listen to songs about them, you can watch them fuck on the internet. In fact, there is nothing else to do. So here she's kind of talking about how our culture, our society, is dominated by the couple form. I mean, it's rare to find kind of an idealization or kind of a cultural work that raises being single or being in a relationship different than the couple form, like close friends or polyamory or anything like that. It's difficult to find any kind of cultural works that elevate it as much as the couple form. The couple form happens in pretty much every kind of movie that there is. But here, kind of Hannah Block, I think in this quote, she kind of touches on kind of a problem with the rejection of the couple form, and she has a kind of very bleak perspective on what lies beyond the couple form. And yeah, so she writes here, despite the efforts of radical groups and the bravery of marginalized communities, it mostly remains the case that in turning away from couple form love, we are turning toward nothing. So yeah, like I said, very bleak. And I'm not sure here if Black is saying that like the close intimacy of close friends or different kind of relationships between people that kind of meet those human needs for touch, for recognition, for intimacy, or whether those those aren't kind of culturally acceptable enough to become kind of acceptable ways of meeting these needs, or if it's the more bleak thing that the couple form kind of fills in this gap of it kind of fills in this nothingness with at least some way of beating back the nothingness. But yeah, if you kind of are more curious about her perspective, you can also just check out the article. It's pretty good. But on the topic of that nothingness, so just going back to the feminist, yeah, he describes his life as this nothingness. So it can happen again, all this nothing, the nothing that was made of words, the reading and discussing and journaling and posting he's defined himself by, just wasted effort composing a wasted life. So here's someone that is clearly kind of living in that nothingness outside of the couple form. And perhaps we as a society need to do more to not idealize the couple form and to build up that kind of nothingness that lies outside the couple form, to give it some kind of dignity that this character is being completely deprived of. And he suffers from that in different ways. Like when he does go to the taco joint, the people there are kind of very mean to him, and it is basically because he's a single man approaching his 40s, which is, I don't know, it's not like a position of being marginalized, I don't think, but I mean there's some slight marginalization going on, I think, toward single people that the story is reflecting. Okay, but here's where kind of my sympathetic reading just stops. So I'm just gonna have some tea. And that's basically just the scapegoating of women. And I don't even really want to read out this quote. It's kind of the language that you would see on the internet in a bunch of different kind of communities like 4chan or these kind of MRA, men's rights activists talk. I don't really want to give it really any more attention than it needs to be given. It's kind of the extreme end of just kind of everyday misogyny, I think. And yeah, where this character kind of goes wrong is that he doesn't take this perhaps suffering that he's experiencing and articulate it in any way that can connect to other people. So he takes that suffering and he turns inward with it. There's a quote from his friend that he's turned his suffering into this this fetish necklace of misery that he just kind of worships, like Gollum down in his cave, his precious, and he doesn't really turn in any way outward to maybe other people who are suffering in the same way, and not just men where he goes to the online forums where there's this rampant misogyny, but women. I mean, women obviously, I think the whole incel movement started off with a queer woman posting on the internet that she felt lonely. So it's not so much a kind of a loneliness isn't gendered in the way that he thinks it is, that where he kind of talks about here that it's women that are making men feel alone. It just doesn't make much sense. There's people from all walks of life that feel loneliness, and rather than kind of reaching out to those kind of people, it's just scapegoating, which has a long history under patriarchy of scapegoating women for all the kind of the flaws with society. But what do we do with this character? How can we help this character? What can we do to kind of stop this kind of descent into violence? Which, to be honest, as the Canadian government putting kind of incel ideology on the list of kind of terrorist activities to monitor, is obviously a kind of big problem in our society today. So, what kind of exit strategies can we present for people going down this path? And obviously, this is kind of very ambitious, but I'm going to just kind of touch on what I think is one way of not fixing this character, but perhaps helping this character. So this character, when he goes to college, he encounters the alien system of codes and manners that govern flirting, conveyed in subtextual cues no more perceptible to him than ultraviolet radiation. So this character really struggles with the act of flirting, and I think that's probably pretty common. But the kind of the path that he takes, where he's trying to set up all these rules and kind of trying to get explanations from women as to why they didn't want him, and this is even going back. So here I just have another quote from a book called "Flirting in the Era of Me Too: Negotiating Intimacy." So this was during the kind of the Me Too era, to get back to that. A Google search for how to flirt produces over 200 million results, with the phrase "how to flirt without being creepy" particularly trending in December 2017 at the early stage of the Me Too movement. So obviously this is kind of a big problem, flirting, which, I don't know, it's I think it's a problem that is useful to kind of examine a little bit more. So just getting into my final slide here. So this is, I'm just drawing quotes from this past book, so Flirting in the Era of Me Too. In this book, we understand flirting to be a social practice that is neither definable nor definite in its shape or meaning, but necessarily ambiguous, maybe awkward, and almost arbitrary in how it might be read and received. So maybe let's talk about this a little bit more. So the feminist is basically always looking for kind of an explanation why women why women reject him. And he wants it almost on paper. He wants them to email him this big kind of long explanation so he can have a record of why this is happening. But flirting is kind of an interaction between people of any gender, is kind of a human action that's governed, at least as these authors write, in a certain ambiguity. So that ambiguity can definitely be dangerous. Like, we're so kind of, I think, aligned with the discourse of consent today. In the TV show Upload, which I think Fletcher mentioned he was watching. I'm also watching it. He mentioned that, he mentioned watching it. In that TV show, it's set in the future, and the discourse of consent, enthusiastic consent, has escalated to the point where before engaging in any kind of sexual activity, people push these buttons on their chest, which says "I consent," and I think it's some app that allows them to do that. So like, that's good. I mean, it's definitely kind of a defense against sexual violence, but also, I mean, it's an app. All these kind of data collection that can occur. There's a lot of also potential problems with allowing an app to negotiate intimacy for us, or to negotiate consent for us. And I think that the way these authors kind of define flirting as having a certain ambiguity, I think that is productive, rather than kind of seeking for rules to kind of govern how men and women should interact with each other, which I also think is what the feminist is going for, and which kind of a lot of obviously people are kind of looking for in those Google searches, with kind of a list of rules to follow, and that will be able to allow you not to be rejected. Kind of focusing on ambiguity instead, I think, could be productive. And then there's just a quote from the same book talking about kind of the etymology of the word flirting. And the authors kind of they compare it to uh, flitting, which is like something that a bird does, like flitting from branch to branch. And with that flitting contained in the word flirting, they write there is a certain lack of goal-oriented direction, a lack of intention conveyed there, which I think would be helpful to the feminist, because whenever he has an interaction with a woman, it's so goal oriented. Like there's a really sad description of him going to the bar and just standing at the back and scanning for potential mates. Like that is so goal oriented, and it kind of covers all his interactions with the opposite sex. And they continue, so the word flirting itself seems strangely groundless and improper, an etymology guaranteed not in meaning, but in sensuality. Metaphor is at the heart of flirting, to express yourself through the flower in another language indirectly. So here they're kind of going off the French origins of the word flirting, and it does mean kind of to throw flowers on the ground. So it's it's something. I like that expression, to express oneself in another language. So not so much to speak the language of feminism, but to speak another language. And I think that can be helpful. And it does kind of connect back to the Philip Sayers piece. So when male writers confront toxic masculinity, he writes, "We need to unlearn the pervasive, often unconscious idea that speech is a form of linguistic combat, a way to shore up one's own power." So I think the language of flirting that these authors are advancing here is one potential way of kind of speaking in a different way. Potentially, I think like all the ideas of ambiguity, of kind of giving yourself up to an encounter rather than following these rules, not to go into it with any kind of expectations, obviously. I think these are all kind of productive ways that we can kind of use language differently, and use language differently than the feminist does, which is this kind of uber rational kind of dissection of women's motives and how to get women, and to follow these certain set of rules and then achieve a certain goal. I think it's very kind of dangerous way to use language, and potentially this definition of flirting can be helpful in kind of altering that. But that's kind of maybe just overly optimistic. So that's it for my presentation for this text. So yeah, we also have students giving presentations this week, so please watch those. They probably are more insightful, maybe in different ways than my own videos. So yeah, there's a lot of viewing material this week, and I don't really ask questions in either of these two videos, but I mean direct questions, but there are kind of questions scattered through. So if any of those made you think about anything, feel free, please, to follow up in the Discord. And I'll see you guys in the Discord. Bye for now.